Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The program emanates from KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's called World Watchers, and this is program number 686, January the 28th, 1985. At the beginning of this year, just about a month ago, I was having a fit. Couldn't get enough writing done, too many telephone calls, too many letters. I'll give you a progress report of what's happened in the last month. I appreciate the phone calls being cut down. The CNN cable news changed in our area. I live in a remote area up on a hill. It was cut off from our area, and we get U.S., which I don't watch. So I have saved myself about an hour and a half a day or 2 hours where I would flick on the news, watch Freeman reports, Crossfire. And so I've had that period to study and read or do whatever I wanted. That saved 2 hours a day in addition to cutting the telephone calls and the mail. My car stereo tape deck has been broken since Thanksgiving. It was sent down to San Diego to be fixed. I've had 2 months in the car with absolute quiet, no news, no interruptions with whatever I want to think about when I drive along. And it really is great to have that silent time. I had the home box office pulled out of my house. I've had a year and several months, and the only movie I saw in about 15 months was Daniel. The rest, I would see the beginning and think they were horrible and turn them off. They were boring compared to what I had to do here that was more interesting. So I cut all of those things out, and my head is much clearer, and I can do more writing and not have that input that we think we need, all this news analysis and talk shows and things that are going on around us that you really don't need if you want to be creative or do any kind of writing or serious putting together of material that is of interest instead of being interrupted, these intrusions of the media coming into your life. And then the fourth thing was that as of January the 1st, I gave up sugar. I've been a vegetarian for over 6 years, but I kicked the sugar habit, really a sugar freak. A subscriber to these broadcasts sent me the book Sugar Blues. I had never read it. I knew about it, but didn't want to know it. And I just decided cold turkey that nothing that has sugar in it, I wouldn't have any part of it or taste of it. I didn't know how I'd survive. I'm doing better than ever and working harder than ever and having more fun. And I don't know if all this will work for you, but I finally think I'm in control of my own self in a way that was getting out of control, running off to eat the cookies and the cakes and baking and the candies and out at the bakeries and socializing, eating the sweets. I feel a lot better for it, and also I have time in my brain without a lot of the news coming in. And it does take that quiet time to absorb a lot of material and books. A lot of good information is coming out by various serious researchers, and there's no way you can mingle it with this constant talk show interview kind of news, which is non-news that will fill your brain. Now, there's an article just this morning in the San Francisco Chronicle, a syndicated story by Richard Reeves, very pertinent to the things that I've been trying to do or the way I feel about events. And he brought up the story of Frank Sinatra at the inaugural, and that when he met Barbara Howar, the reporter of Entertainment Tonight, HOWAR, that Sinatra walked up to her and said, "You're dead. Every one of you, you're all dead." Now, I read that he had said that, and I didn't understand what there was that caused him to say it, except that Sinatra used to have a lot of temper tantrums and goon squads and beat people up. He was a notorious person for anger and fits of anger and putting them on other people, physical, not just verbal. But this is at the inaugural ball, and it was picked up by the various broadcasters and on the microphone. And Reeves went on to say that what made him so mad was a story in the Washington Post about the old Rat Pack that Sinatra and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis and Peter Lawford ganged around together, went together, and that Sinatra had known a gangster or two, and that the grand jury or two would have liked to have known him better. And he got mad at that, and that was his gripe for the evening. And Richard Reeves says there's a lesson to the tempest of the temperament, and that's the press, like most everything and everyone else in America, doesn't pay enough attention to what they think is stale material. The press calls it stale material. They decide for us. You don't want the past. And he says, in more elegant phrasing, we have no sense of history. We're always paying the price for that. Americans want to live in the present. They don't care much about the past. The first lawsuit in the new state of California included two very important American ones. The statute of limitations was reduced for prosecution of past crimes, and procedures were eased whereby people could change their names. And he said that same attitude applies to bankruptcy laws. It applies to when you meet people at bars. They can be one person for one night. Their names are faked. We get people applying for jobs. The resumes are faked. And people come across imposters as teachers, getting high salaries who aren't supposed to be teachers, and surgeons who aren't surgeons that didn't go to medical school. And he asked the question, why drag up stale material, whether or not somebody actually went to Princeton? He says, in our politics, disdain for the stale stuff allows candidates and public officials regularly to get away with the murder of the truth. And this applies, and I interject to what Richard Reeves says, was the disdain for what you call the stale stuff gets in the way with biographies and autobiographies that publishers put out that do not allow you to have the truth. And he says they frequently get away with murder of the truth, and they also, we know, get away with murder. He says Gary Hart can go along and lie about his age. Senator McCarthy lied about his heroic war record. Nixon lied when he says he's a new Nixon, and he turned out to have the same stale defects as the old. There's a focus on Ronald Reagan as the performer of the day, but they never get into the stale stuff of how he got where he was and how he got his money and what he did during the war. Now, just last week I was talking about Reagan during the war with the OSS duplicating the bombing of Peenemünde and the rocket scientists, and then being on commissions to cover up the murder of John Kennedy later, when Mr. Walter Dornberger and Werner von Braun were part of the plans and plot to murder John Kennedy. A full cycle there. And Reeves concludes by saying Sinatra may like it, but the stale material is the real stuff about him, and that's what upsets him so much. So does that give him a right to beat up a woman reporter? What they said about him was true. There wasn't anything untrue about it. And now we get to the stale stuff of CBS filming the Errol Flynn biography. Miss Keating, Doris Keating, bought the rights to Errol Flynn's biography 8 years ago. Her father, Barry Mahon, M-E-H-O-N, was Flynn's business manager. The family lived next door to the actor in Rome and in Tangier, and she was very close to him, and she wanted to write about his life in Hollywood, which is her prerogative. A few years later, just after she bought the rights to the movie, Charles Hyam came out with his book on Errol Flynn and his Nazi connections to Dr. Urban, who was a close friend of Errol Flynn's. And so what they did in the movie, they changed his name. Instead of being Dr. Urban of the Gestapo, they gave him an Irish name, and the Dutch doctor was given this cute Irish name so that you wouldn't recognize him as being in the Gestapo if that name is in history books. So they make him in the movie a humanitarian and a rustabout. And according to the Flynn biographer, this Dr. Urban, he was an Austrian-born doctor who became a United States citizen in 1930. This is Charles Hyam's book. He was suspected of being a Nazi spy during the 30s, and his citizenship was revoked in 1951 for reasons of national security. Now, I don't fault her for making a movie on his days in Hollywood, but what is the problem is by leaving out the name of his friend. When they wanted Olivia de Havilland in the film with him, they didn't call her Doris something else and make up fictitious names. The names of the other people were real, but the member of the Gestapo was changed. If Flynn was all the things he was to her, just leave the name in. People have written about Mrs. Bormann and Mrs. Goebbels or Mrs. Goering. If you love the Nazi or he's a friend of yours and he's so fascinating to you, don't admit you don't like him, but what are you hiding when you leave it out? There's another book coming out about Dr. Urban by a Mr. Strober, S-T-R-O-I-B-E-R. He completed a book called Alibi, a biography of Dr. Urban, and he wrote to CBS that hiding the true identity of one particular character in a docudrama in which all other major characters are called by their correct names, is not only misleading millions of TV viewers into thinking Flynn's best friend is a harmless eccentric, but it debases the memory of those who suffered under Nazism. This is an article from the New York Times, January the 16th, by Stephen Farber. Paul Bigrow, the vice president of CBS program, responded to Mr. Stroper. He said, the film we're presenting is an autobiography, a common accepted literary and dramatic form on Errol Flynn, which is all right. But the accusation they're saying is, if you're going to have the character in it all, have him in it. Because Mr. Hyam, in his biography, The Untold Story, published by Doubleday, made a variety of accusations about Flynn's involvement with Nazis, with the Nazi Party, papers from the State Department, the FBI, the suspected espionage of Dr. Erban, Dr. Erban's working with Errol Flynn and correspondence with him that reflects Flynn's pro-Nazi sympathies and his anti-Semitic remarks. And the filmmakers knew enough about Errol Flynn and Dr. Erban to leave Erban's name out of the film. So therefore, CBS are protecting the Nazis. Charles Hyam had said that the FBI kept files for many years at that time, and said Flynn's notoriety, his sexual notoriety, contributed to that, and they wanted to make him out apolitical, the point is, in the film. But Flynn and Erban together were not apolitical animals, so leave Erban out altogether, or don't give him another name in the film to deceive people. Now, the comment of CBS News, according to the producers, was their position was, we thought it would be boring to deal with politics. Don Taylor was the director, Steve Mills, the production vice president. Now, you might want to write those names down and write to CBS, to Don Taylor, or to Steve Mills, the vice president of the production, because their idea is to steer clear of political controversy. No, they're protecting Errol Flynn. It's nothing to do with the production at all. The controversy comes later. Let them make the film of whatever they want. If he's got this friend and he's so nice to him, put him in there and let the cookies crumble wherever they fall. CBS says, no, you'll be bored. You don't want to deal with politics. Now, that's the same mentality that Richard Reeves was talking about in the paper today, that the past is boring. We'll show you our version today of Flynn, and we can make up any name we want if his politics stunk to high heaven, and there's absolute proof that he, too, was a Nazi. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the news about Senator Jesse Helms trying to get a consortium from North Carolina to buy up CBS. The group Fairness in Media are working with that, and one of their targets is Dan Rather. They want to get that CBS anchor man, that liberal Dan Rather. In the memo it says, that's not what the free press means to me. Well, I never thought I would agree with Jesse Helms on any subject, but I don't think Dan Rather represents the free press either. Now, I make a suggestion to Dan Rather if he wants to defend himself against the planned takeover. Dan Rather was in Dallas, Texas. He accompanied the shooting of John Kennedy with the famous remarks that Penn Jones inserted into the Zapruder film showing John Kennedy's head blown off. When the head was going backward to show that the bullet came from the front, based on a nice law of physics, and the head is thrown back, Dan Rather made the television version and the video version that Kennedy's fatal shot, his head goes forward. And in the film, if you've seen it, he plays this over and over. The head goes forward. That's Dan Rather telling you that the fatal shot came from behind the head when the fatal shot of John Kennedy came from the front to the back. Now, Dan Rather has lied on this point for 22 years. And being the good boy of CBS and carrying the lie for all these years, what does it get him? He's called a liberal. There's one way to get to Jesse Helms. He could contact me, and I would give him the James Frankenberry affidavits and remarks that the plan to kill John Kennedy was done in Jesse Helms' backyard at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And Mr. Frankenberry became aware of it when several defendants in the Watergate case were down recruiting people for the shooting team that would go to General Walker's house that was blamed later on Lee Harvey Oswald and didn't touch Walker, and would shoot John Kennedy, they thought they were practicing to murder a foreign dignitary, practicing in the United States at Fort Bragg to kill a foreign dignitary. But then he found out it was John Kennedy, recognizing the Watergate team. Now, Frank Sturgis wasn't always Frank Sturgis. He was Frank Fiorino. And he worked in disinformation with the Schlumberger, the Double Check Organization, the anti-Castro Cubans, and Lee Harvey Oswald with that can of worms during the Watergate times. And this man recognized several people, defendants in the Watergate case, recruiting and working with the marksmen at North Carolina. And this is the Jesse Helms territory, his close affiliation not only to Mr. D'Aubuisson and the death squads currently in El Salvador, but to the German Nazis that formed the special forces in his hometown of North Carolina, his home state. So I suggest if Dan Rather wanted to be heroic at this time where there are no heroes, he could come forward and challenge Jesse Helms to open up the investigation of the Kennedy assassination and the crossfire and the fatal shot coming out of North Carolina. That would be a little bit closer to the truth. I want to just bring up a few items just for a moment, and then a great deal on the Howard Hughes case because of the new book that just came out on Howard Hughes, and I've been inundated with telephone calls to talk about the Howard Hughes because of the work I've done on that. But there are a few other items that I did want to bring up to you before I get to that. One is that Kathy Evelyn Smith has returned from Canada for an arraignment in regards to the John Belushi murder. And she was showed up at her press conference and was on the NBC Today show with Howard Weitzman, her attorney. In case you don't know it, remember it, Weitzman was the gentleman who got John DeLorean off the hook with that drug deal when DeLorean was directly linked to large narcotic traffickers and down to Klaus Barbie in Bolivia before he was arrested. Weitzman graduated from the University of Southern California. He went to law school. He represented Mary Bruner, a disciple of the Charles Manson case, another CIA Defense Department case out of the LAPD, and won her acquittal on murder. He got DeLorean's acquittal. She still sends him Christmas cards. This was a report in the newspaper at the time of the DeLorean trial called The Howard and Don Show. Those are the two reporters that carried DeLorean. It's from the LA Times. Mr. Weitzman represented Tom Dragna, one of the 5 reputed mobsters, on racketeering and murder charges. He was convicted 2 counts and cleared of the murder charges. He had a major setback with Grandma Mafia, Barbara Muzine, who was charged and sent with 25 years in prison. And he's been helping the DeLorean. He helped the DeLorean case get off. And he's made a threat right on television on NBC that if Kathy were charged in this case for any major crime or had to go to trial, he would bring in all the people that she dealt narcotics with in Los Angeles. And one of the sources I was told was the brother of Daryl Gates of the Los Angeles Police Department. January the 24th, 1985, the San Jose Mercury has a quote from the former Los Angeles County District Attorney Robert Filibosian. And he said Wednesday that he had forbid his prosecutors to plea bargain with Kathy Smith at all. I had given clear policy directions, not to do any plea bargaining in this case. He says that case was not a manslaughter. It was not a manslaughter. It's a murder case. And be sure with Mr. Howard Weitzman and what he knows about crime and the Los Angeles Police Department and the links also to the higher-ups in that city. The Johnny Carson cocaine connections will and are, I know, linked to Kathy Smith and the Belushi demise. If somebody would follow that through, the way I've studied it, they're just about a hair's breadth away from each other. Now, one of the people that went to see John Belushi, Leslie Marks, her name is, testified to the grand jury that he looked very tired and distraught. He was pale, he was coughing, choking noises in his sleep the day before, and his arms were red with these needles. Can't anybody in that city call 911? I've asked that before. I mean, doesn't anybody have a finger that calls the emergency and says, get this guy to a hospital? There's 2 criteria for incarcerating somebody. It doesn't matter if they're rich or poor, famous, infamous, the world's richest like Howard Hughes, or the poorest, this is a controversial man making movies about politicians and the FBI and the mafia wineries, a brilliant man opposing our position in El Salvador, a very political person making caricatures of the great Henry Kissinger on Saturday Night Live and a lot of other public officials, Barbara Wawa and all of them. You take your little finger, in case you're ever in this position, you dial 911 and you get emergency. If a person is a danger to somebody else or a danger to themselves, even if they voluntarily want to do it, you can have them committed at least 72 hours and 2 weeks on to save their life, where he could get back to his wife in New York. How do these people have the nerve to stream through that hotel room and testify that he is sick? And remember that this Kathy left the place after he was dead and went out and had breakfast and then comes back with paraphernalia. This is horrendous, and as long as this thing is allowed to happen, it will happen over and over and over again. It's a disgusting story. John Belushi I happen to be very fond of him and watch Saturday Night Live continuously, and I think he was a genius, and I know he was murdered. I did broadcast on it, and these people literally get away with murder over and over again. Now, another team that gets away with murder is the Soldier of Fortune group. Mr. Robert Brown, who publishes it, the protege of John Singlaub, the famous board member of Western Goals, head of the World Anti-Communist League, working out of Taiwan with Nazis and death squads all over the world to keep a handful of people controlling the resources of the world. The story this week, the Soldier of Fortune magazine reprints the CIA Contra Manual. When the CIA is put on the fire, and Mr. Casey, the protege of William Donovan, has said you can't tell them how to kill judges and public officials, and how to sabotage countries in your psychological warfare of carrying on your guerrilla warfare down there in Nicaragua, or with the bosses in El Salvador to keep the property in the hands of a few for whatever reasons. And now the Contras are murdering in Honduras, death squads in Honduras, just like they've done through this whole area. When the CIA has said they can't do it, then along comes Mr. Brown, who works with Singlaub. Singlaub is up at the National Security Council, the Defense Department, and was behind the getting out of these magazines, these dangerous mercenary magazines that are the government. They've become the extension of what our government is. If Congress votes that we can't do a certain thing, then they do it. And I have a lot more to put on the air about that, and will. But this week, the Soldier of Fortune magazine reprinted the manual. I have a copy of the manual. It refers to Christian soldiers, to everything there is Christian. They take Jewish money from Israel to help the Contras, and the Jewish money from Israel has always been strong with the Somozas. It's been a love affair, vice versa. They don't mind that or the Jewish weapons they take, but it's a Christian war for Christ, and the idea that Soldier of Fortune is not put on the carpet or put out of business because what they do at Congress isn't allowed, telling them they can't do, is showing that invisible government as a visible alternative. Whatever the men in Washington are voted to say or do, it is negated by a handful of people who then go ahead and do it anyway, and you call that freedom of speech. Now, we haven't heard much about Donovan's trial recently. I just wanted to quickly read something that was sent to me from The Nation magazine. A researcher in Florida, David Miller, sends me a lot of good articles. He's a writer, and he sent me one February 28th, 1981, Something Rotten in New Jersey. 1981 was right after Ronald Reagan was in, and Raymond Donovan was selected as Secretary of Labor, right after those hearings, immediately. And The Nation magazine said the FBI's pre-confirmation investigation of Donovan turned up 18 specific allegations of wrongdoings of him and the Schiavone Construction Company. The most damaging charges were those made by the FBI informant Ralph Picardo, remember his relationship to the Hoffa murder, who said Donovan personally met with him 20 times in 1967 and 68, gave him payments from Schiavone. Funds were never delivered to construction sites that were never made, and these were obviously payoffs. Orrin Hatch, the righteous Mormon senator from Utah, chairman of the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee, said the FBI made a mistake and pushed the Donovan confirmation through. They made a mistake, but he was on a committee that approved of the Donovan passage as Secretary of Labor, And the article goes into the Washington Legal Foundation that had a petition set up for Donovan. The foundation's National Advisory Board is a who's who of the new right. Among them, the then-living Larry McDonald, the Georgia's congressman, the card-carrying member, the head of the John Birch Society, and also on the advisory board is Orrin Hatch of Utah, who spearheaded the defeat of the AFL-CIO unions reform, the labor reform, and who was one who shepherded Donovan's confirmation through Labor and Human Resources Committee. He was on the board of the group pushing for Donovan. On the surface, he blamed the FBI for running it through, but on the side, he was always for Donovan, Orrin Hatch, and he's on an anti-drug committee with Daniel Graham, which is a farce, when Donovan and the mafia are very much part and parcel of the entire drug problem. Also, People's World had a story October the 2nd, 1984, that I didn't have on the air, didn't have time, on Donovan as a member, one of the early members of the Young Americans for Freedom. Now, this is Ronald Reagan and Charles Willoughby and Robert Morris and William Buckley, and that can of worms from up in Sharon, Connecticut, down to Texas, and with prominent warriors, future Cold Warriors on the board. This article says that Donovan was with Ronald Reagan and a number of high-level government people on the National Advisory Board of the right-wing group Young Americans for Freedom. It was formed in 1960. The YAF had support for General Key of South Vietnam, who they were founded in 1960. Now, Key is one of the big drug dealers in Orange County at the present time, and Key's group are involved in the murder of a professor who's been fighting for freedom in Vietnam. They call him a communist. He has a death squad in this state, a drug group in this state, and he's living right now near San Clemente, the home where Ronald Reagan used to live, out in that territory, San Clemente. But they were fighting hard and protecting Premier Key, who admired Adolf Hitler, and it's Raymond Donovan, not William, that's the OSS. Raymond Donovan was an early member of this committee of who's who, Adolf Monjou and the far right wing. Now, since he's been the Secretary of Labor, he's reduced the requirements for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He has cut down the funds for the committee, largest cutbacks from the Labor Committee of any group that have been in Congress or any cabinet position. Cut the budget of $45 billion just last year. When this was written in 1983, the department was second to none in contribution to the initial budget cut of $45 billion. And we contributed $9 billion of the initial cut. Out of the 45 was the labor group. Well, Donovan was one of the early Reagan, William Buckley, the Knights of Malta, Robert Morris, and that gang. Far right-wing mentality put in charge of labor, which is exactly the kind of appointments Ronald Reagan's been making across the board. Recently, there have been some horrible ones. I haven't updated the Reagan appointments, but I'll get to that. There was just a small article noticing in the newspaper, this was last October, somebody wrote in that, isn't that Ray Donovan, having next to him Bill Bittman, his attorney, who was the unindicted co-conspirator in a Watergate cover-up, handing vast sums of cash to E. Howard Hunt from Bittman and trying to get them to plead guilty. Yeah, that was the bag man. We've talked about William Bittman before. He's also the attorney for Edwin Wilson of the CIA and his nefarious dealings. So the background of Raymond Donovan, I just wanted to bring out not only to the YAF, but to Orrin Hatch and the committee that pressured to get Donovan through, knowing that the FBI had information on him and his links to organized crime. The Donovan investigation is still going on. The trial hasn't started yet, of course, and he's still Secretary of Labor. Ronald Reagan refuses to have him step down as Secretary of Labor. Another one of my favorite cases is in the news this week again. They keep resurrecting. The ones that I've done stories on all through the years are never-ending stories. If they had an end, I wouldn't have to be doing them. They're open cases, and that's why I do them and keep updating them. And that's the story of Josef Mengele and the new reports that Canada may have had him and that he may have been in the custody of the American Army at the time he left Europe and went to South America. Josef Mengele is an interesting person for lots of reasons. The parts about Auschwitz, you know, but his role after the war and his experimentation with Paraguayan Indians and medical genocide continued after the war, and he had links to the United States of intelligence all along. We'll take a 1-minute break and get back to Josef Mengele and then Howard Hughes, and there isn't much difference between the two, or you might ask about the Hughes Medical Center and the relationship to Josef Mengele. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of broadcast number 686 on KAZU in Pacific Grove, California. It's January the 28th, 1985. And now I'll continue with the story of Mr. Mengele. I have a friend who wrote a book about Josef Mengele, Brian Richard Bolin. I've mentioned him before. The book is called The Final Trace, published in 1983. All the work that he did with another associate in South America, they were employed to bring Mr. Mengele back, if they could, bring him back alive to this country, wasn't possible because he was very much more protected than Klaus Barbie. They could have brought him back dead, but they wanted to bring him back alive. And in the course of their work, they have a lot of information and have studied various problems of Nazis who escaped and so forth. But his life was threatened and he was in danger if this book was published as nonfiction. And the only part of fiction that he put in it, according to what he says, is the epilogue. And it was because of the epilogue and certain events in the news this week that I thought I better call him and update the news. Now, this is the fellow who had hired airplanes to take him down to South America. He's been down there many times. And on one of the trips that he was supposed to go, the plane was stopped. I mean, he couldn't use that pilot. It was Mr. William Hetrick, because Hetrick had been arrested and was involved later then with bringing in John DeLorean, and it was Hetrick's trips down to Klaus Barbie that caused Richard to understand or Bolin the connection of the Klaus Barbie, John DeLorean narcotic connections. And furthermore, he was the one who told me about one of the vice presidents of Associated Press who took the money from the narcotic traffic that Mr. Martin Bormann receives, not Martin Bormann, but Klaus Barbie, and also they work with Martin Bormann as the banker. The money from the drug profits goes into an account in Switzerland, represented by the attorney of Josef Mengele. So the Mengele story ties into the United States Hollywood connection of narcotics in New York and New Jersey and London and Ireland and the Swiss bank and the Cayman banks of Mr. DeLorean and all that. But it ties to Klaus Barbie and Josef Mengele in a very direct way. And Mengele's name is in the news this past week because of certain documents that were received from the Freedom of Information Act. And they've also admitted that they've locked up 5. It's closer probably to 500. But they haven't retrieved a lot of material that is pertinent to this story. But the last part of the epilogue of Richard's book on Mengele is about a man whose daughter is held as a hostage to Mengele, that they're supposed to bring in Mr. Walter Rauff, 3 top Nazis, and Mueller and Mengele into an airport in Mexico, or they're going to be turned in or agree to come in. And when they come, they already have another plane ready, and they understand that they're going to be trapped, and they hire a private plane to take off for La Paz, Bolivia. And the epilogue is about what happens to the plane from the time that the 3 top Nazis leave South America and then quickly return back to South America when they understand that they're about to be captured. The epilogue says someone learned about the bomb that Herman Fried had stored on the airplane that was taking them down there, and they were able to get a message through to the distinguished passengers, but not soon enough. 4 hours after Rosen's death, Rosen was a fellow shot at the airport when the plane took off, who was wanting to bring them in. The air traffic controller at El Alto Aeroporto on the plane above La Paz, Bolivia, announced there would be an emergency landing and cleared the airport approach for all traffic. However, the charter passenger jet exploded violently in midair about a mile from touchdown, shrinking wreckage over the surrounding countryside. During the following days, rescue parties were able to retrieve the bodies of all but 3 persons known to have been aboard the plane. A week later, an Associated Press stringer, he brings in his AP man, filed a short item about reports from peasants in northern Bolivia who saw what they officials believed were 3 parachutes in the sky shortly before the plane exploded. The police are investigating. So that was the last chapter of his book, which is based on all true experience of Josef Mengele in South America. And the reason I called him was because of the airplane crash that took place in the Andes just at a very important time. And I took note of it because Mrs. V. Klarsfeld, the woman who has claimed the responsibility, and probably so, of bringing Klaus Barbie to Europe, if not to trial yet, it hasn't started. She's made trips to South America, one to Argentina, to help the families of the victims of death squads, about 50,000 that were killed, and the mothers protesting there and in Chile against Pinochet. And she recently, at the end of the year, I remember the date because I was down in Los Angeles. It was on the 31st of December, just this last month, or around January the 1st. Via Clarksville was on her way down to Bolivia to ask Mr. Stroessner to give Klaus Barbie back for trial, which of course he never would do. And just about the same day she was arriving down there on this trip, there was an interesting airplane crash on the way to La Paz, Bolivia. This one is from Paraguay, Asuncion to La Paz, Bolivia. The Los Angeles Times, January 3rd, has the story, U.S. envoy's wife among 29 lost in the Andes crash. La Paz, Bolivia, the wreckage of an Eastern Airline jetliner was found Wednesday night on the side of the Illimani Mountain, 20 hours after it was reported missing. There were no survivors, apparently, among the 29 passengers and crew. 8 Americans, among them the wife of the American ambassador, Mary Ann Davis, wife of the United States ambassador to Paraguay, and his name is Arthur H. Davis, and the United States State Department's representative for the Peace Corps, William Kelly, the director of the Peace Corps in Paraguay. Now, according to the news, they cited a wreckage of the plane. There are no visible markings on the airplane. We can't tell if it's an Eastern airline or not because there's no Eastern colors or no Eastern logo. Now, the head of Eastern Airline is Mr. Borman, the former NASA pilot who worked with Wernher von Braun and Walter Dornberger. And this plane, if it's a commercial plane taking the wife of the ambassador or the Peace Corps director, would certainly have markings on it. This reminds me of the kind of plane that would fly from Nicaragua to try and attempt the Bay of Pigs invasion for the CIA. They have a plane that leaves Asuncion in Paraguay, and this plane had no markings, and it had no logo, and they in no Eastern colors to identify it, which is really weird. The Bolivian Air Force plane, the Bolivian Army sent somebody in there, Colonel Grover Rojas said, and they said it appeared the plane crashed head-on. Among the plane passengers were 9 Korean passengers and 7 Paraguayan. Now, Reverend Moon and the South Koreans were very active and are in nearby Uruguay. Reverend Moon is supposed to practically own that entire country, and he's been very close to providing help for Licio Gelli and also for Mr. Josef Mengele. There were stories about Mengele and the Moonies being given protection down in South America. There were Koreans on the plane, the head of the Peace Corps, and the ambassador's wife. It left Asuncion, Paraguay at 5:57 p.m., and it was due 2 hours later at 7:48, and it wasn't seen. Another story, January the 6th, in the San Jose Mercury, tells about the Peruvian Army helicopter arriving to try and retrieve parts of the plane. I think of Peru and Mr. Stefano Jeff Delachaye, the right-hand man of the death squads of Europe, and Licio Gelli, working with the Shining Path and the narcotic people in Peru. The Bolivian Army sent people up to the plane. The Peruvians sent a helicopter up to retrieve, and the United States Air Force was going to send a high-altitude helicopter. The team went up there, and they reached the plane. The plane was destroyed, but there were no survivors. Now, the first thing that came to my mind was this so-called fiction based upon a lot of logical deductions that when I figured that maybe the day that Mrs. Klarsfeld arrived, that some of the Moonies and the Peace Corps director and the ambassador's wife would be on this airplane, this unmarked, incidentally, I've mentioned, airplane, and be taking this thing to get him out of Paraguay and into Bolivia, where Josef Mengele could be protected. Maybe Christian von Damm, the vice president of the Bank of America from La Paz, Bolivia, might meet him. That's Helene von Damm's husband. She's our ambassador to Vienna, and she keeps his name. And I haven't any doubt that Christian von Damm knows Klaus Barbie and Josef Mengele very well down there. If they had all worked with the American government, if they did, and he's from Germany and works down there in that position at the Bank of America, I haven't any doubt that Christian von Damm would know a lot about this if he were brought home and asked some questions. But the point is that once the plane was found, they're always looking for that little black box like the Korean airline 007. But they spent time around it. There isn't the sign of a passenger. And I thought that was an interesting thing to read about the search for Josef Mengele now, and sending for State Department papers on him, and the way that mysterious plane left, because it's really been a non-story. Eastern Airlines has said very little about that plane, and there hasn't been too much notice or comments about the plane wreck, and there's been a lot of news about Mr. Mengele. Now, the Army withholding these papers is important. I have had on the air many, many times. A lot of new listeners don't know it. Papers from the FBI, Freedom of Information, saying that Josef Mengele lived up near near Sedona, Arizona, and he was in Nevada and California, and he used an alias, Mr. Herrmann, and if you want, I can read it again on the air for you. I have it here. The reason I got that from Freedom of Information Act was that the person who got it for me was with Josef Mengele in Honduras. And he was with his own uncle, who was a Nazi war criminal during the war, who fled this country. Now, the Wiesenthal Center and Rabbi Heir, H-E-I-R, and Simon Wiesenthal and Mr. Mendelsohn in Washington, the Jewish organizations will not admit or even attempt to explain. Their answer is that there was another Josef Mengele, and that wasn't him. The reason this Mengele was never brought to trial was he was an American citizen. He was naturalized in New York. His naturalization was suspect, just like Dr. Erban, who worked with the Gestapo and worked with Errol Flynn. This is a story, again, like the Howard Hughes story, that just simply won't wash away because people refuse to go into where is the other Mengele. If this is a different Josef Mengele, just show me the other one and I'll be satisfied. Well, one more item, and we get to Howard Hughes. I just have 15 more minutes, so we'll have to do a lot of views next week. The people that were shot by John Hinckley have asked a lawsuit that recently was turned down, the victims, to pursue the case against the doctor in Denver, Colorado, the psychiatrist who didn't tell them that John W. Hinckley was dangerous. These men have sued the psychiatrist, John J. Hopper, Jr., because they didn't warn the Secret Service about him, and they claim that their damages are severe. One is Press Secretary James Brady, the other is Secret Service agent Timothy J. McCarthy, and the other is Thomas K. Delahanty. Now, I called Washington, D.C., and Maryland, and Georgetown, and Virginia, and all I could find out is that these three names are unlisted, and I would like to get in touch with them for the reason that John Hinckley was in the Posse Comitatus. He was in the American Nazi Party, and I think we could prove his links up to the Aryan Nation and Mr. Gale and the California Nazis and the extreme right-wing group that he traveled with and worked with. And if all of this is true, then the prosecution and Edward Bennett Williams and the entire legal team denied these people of their rights, not only of the security of knowing about John Hinckley and his interest in the Kennedy assassination and in conspiracies and in murders, but his links in California and to Chicago and in Tennessee and Texas to the Nazi Party and the Posse Comitatus. Now, I do have the names of the Secret Service men who were at my home. They came once because I believed that was John Hinckley in front of my house in January of 1981. They came back when they identified the car of Hinckley, the license that I wrote down, as being a member of the Posse Comitatus. Now, that's part of the identity group, and the Christian fundamentalist group that do want to kill every Jew in America, every black in America, that have computers from Texas that are set up in Idaho and around the country to give names and addresses of where people live. The very month that I believe that was Hinckley at my house in January, there's an article in the San Francisco Chronicle about the Nazis and their role in killing John Kennedy and John Lennon and a lot of other people in between. And it was no coincidence, within a short time, this particular person was sitting in front of my house. So if any of you can help me get the address of one of those three men, or all of them, I would appreciate it, and I'll get to them and see what we can do. Now, we'll start on the Hughes, and I'll do a lot more next week. I did want to update some of these things like Mengele's and Donovan and some important things that are in the news. There's a new book out about Howard Hughes. It's getting a lot of attention. Citizen Hughes by Michael Drosnin, Drosnin. I'll have the book by tomorrow. Tom Davis carries it at research, and he's bringing it down, and I will have the book. I heard the Phil Donahue show of the author, Michael Drosnin, sitting there with Mr. Mayhew. I taped it. Many of you saw it, and I'll send for that. It was a pathetic sparring between two people who are both guilty. Mayhew claiming that Drosnin is writing a book about stolen material that he should be locked up for having people steal it from the Hughes headquarters on Romaine Street in Hollywood and making money off of it. And Mayhew should be locked up for making money off of Hughes when he never saw him, and hiring assassination hit teams and justifying himself on the television that if somebody had shot Hitler, he would have saved the world. Well, Fidel Castro isn't exactly Adolf Hitler, and using Sam Giancana and John Rosselli with their track records, Robert Mayhew can't interpret for us who's to live and who's to die according to his particular politics. There's another book, The Secret Agenda by Jim Hogan on Watergate and Howard Hughes. And I've studied so much about Hughes that I will get into both of those books at great length and in detail. There is a series running out, 5-part series in various newspapers syndicated on the book on Howard Hughes. And from Houston, Texas, a friend sent me part 5 of that, where it refers to the book that Clifford Irving did on Howard Hughes. He wrote a book and pretended that they were memos of Howard Hughes because he decided that Hughes was either dead or disabled and no shape to make a public appearance. So that gave him an idea that he would concoct his own epic and present it to the world as an autobiography. Now, the important thing about these articles, and this is why you have to take time to read them and don't listen to all the talk shows or the blah blahs about it. And they're important only to see how much gets passed up as disinformation to add to further lies. Clifford Irving may have had the idea that he wanted to write a book about Hughes because he was dead or disabled. Well, there's a difference. If you're dead, then somebody is running the empire, so you have to confront the empire. If they're simulating his life, you're in more trouble than if he's alive, because if he's dead and the empire is still running, what makes you think at that point you can pretend you know Hughes? They'd come down harder than ever. And if he's disabled, the same logic applies. Clifford Irving says, I think I'll write a book about Howard Hughes. This was in 1971, 72. Because if he's incapacitated, he won't know the difference. Therefore, I can do it. The important thing is that McGraw-Hill, the publisher, accepted the book knowing that Howard Hughes was either alive or controlled by a mass bloc that would respond. And the second point is that they brought in the world's best handwriting experts, as they did with the Hitler diaries, where that $3 million went to the Waffen-SS. Forget the hoax. The money went to the rebirth of the Nazi Party. That's where it sits. And they brought in Mr. Osborne and a team of the world's greatest handwriting experts. And the handwriting expert said, yes, that is Howard Hughes. So how would Clifford Irving get past the best experts unless the book was meant to be put out? And the book was meant to be out because then it created the excuse for a telephone conversation that was taped, and I've played the record on the air, and I'll play it again, of Howard supposedly talking. The Clifford Irving story is a very important part of Watergate and of the Hughes saga, and later I'll get back to it again and put it in its context. Now, how and when did I get started in the Hughes case? I was doing my research on the Kennedy assassination, and then when my article came out in The Realist, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, Bruce Roberts called me. I was on KGO radio and contacted me, and he's the fellow who wrote the Gemstone file. And he gave me 300 or 400 handwritten pages about the Gemstone. That was the Watergate secrets and the Washington secrets, and there were two important areas that he opened up for me that I was not studying at the time, when I had been studying the Kennedy assassination from November 63 until I started the Watergate story in June of 72. One was the Vatican connection to the spy network around the world that I hadn't even really thought about. I'd been cross-filing the Warren Commission hearings, and there wasn't much about the Vatican in there. He opened up the Vatican connection. Well, in this past year, there were books, Oh Vatican by Paul Hoffman, In God's Name by David Yallop, St. Peter's Banker by DeFonso, God's Banker by Cornwell, La Popessa, The Vatican Connections by Richard Hammer, The Vatican Millions by Arrow Manhattan. Just 7 books is 10 or more good exposés. The Vatican. In those days, Vatican was not a household word. Vatican and OSS, Vatican and Nazis. There wasn't that much about the Vatican. He opened that up for me. And the second part he opened up for me is the Howard Hughes connections. He told me that Hughes was buried in 1971, that he was staying with Onassis, who was taking care of him because he was brain damaged. And at that point, I got as many articles and books and collected filing cabinets of Hughes, every book that was written. And I wrote an article for Playgirl magazine with Stephanie Caruana, Is Howard Hughes Dead and Buried Off a Greek Island? And I'll tell you more about that article if we have time now, otherwise next week. You can send for that if you want. I charge $3, and I'll send you a copy. It was published in December 1974, 11 years ago. Is Howard Hughes Dead and Buried Off a Greek Island? And that was based on 2 years' research. I took what Bruce Roberts told me and then spent those 2 years delving into it and was convinced that Howard was in fact dead and that he didn't exist any longer from April 16th, 1971 on. And of course, that kept me saving every article and every book from 71. The Watergate broke in 72 and the Hughes name came forward. He wasn't a household word, believe me, until 72 and 73 with the Watergate hearings. So I was saving this material on Hughes. And then in 1976, the body was cashed in, brought from Mexico to Texas. And then, of course, I had to follow even more, and to this day, the evidence of why it isn't Howard Hughes and why they're all lying and what happened to Howard Hughes. Now, I did this work until the person died that they called Howard Hughes. I immediately contacted Clarence Kelly of the FBI, the director at the time of the fingerprinting of Hughes. I corresponded with him, and many of you know I was making a movie with Manuel Zacina on the Howard Hughes story. He's a producer from Nicaragua who was kicked out of this country because of what we were doing on the Hughes story, and my house was broken into and my papers and correspondence with Clarence Kelly were removed, and the FBI sent them back to me without his original signature on, just our correspondence. And through Zacina I met Terry Moore, and through Terry Moore I met Johnny Meyer, and I'll do more on Johnny next week, who worked for the Hughes organization, who confirmed that Hughes had been dead, that I was absolutely right, that there was no Howard Hughes. Now, there were a lot of reasons that they had to bring him in. I use the word cash him in by April the 5th, 1976. As a matter of fact, I had a sweatshirt made. I have a few of these sweatshirts. They're made in Colorado that have sayings on that I like. This one was made immediately. Exhume Vance Cooper, 4-5- April the 5th, 1976, Houston, Texas. That's when the body was placed into the grave. December the 15th, 1976, on Good Morning America, and this has all been taped. In fact, I was going to put on the tape tonight, but I was too lazy to get out of my boxes of stuff, so I'll dig for it next week and put it on the air for you. It's an interview with Brooks Randall on Good Morning America, December the 15th, 1976. Jack Anderson was on, and David Hartman, And Brooks Randall was interesting to me because I wrote in the article 2 years earlier that he was one of the doubles for Howard Hughes, and he confirmed on this program that he was the body of Howard Hughes for various activities, but he was not the voice. He said the voice of Howard Hughes was Vance Cooper, who's buried in a Texas grave. The man in the grave, buried April the 5th, 1979, is not Howard Hughes. Now, this is old news. This is what Frank Sinatra would call old news, or what CBS would call boring. You know, we don't want that old stuff. Well, too bad. Dig it out, David Hartman, and put it on. Vance Cooper was in the grave, and he went on to say that Mike Chouinard hired the bodyguards and the doubles for Howard Hughes, and the office staff that were working for Hughes, he said on the television, never saw any of them in their life, which was true, and that all the stories had to be straightened out through one certain source, and that the Attorney General, John Hill, didn't believe that Howard Hughes was buried in Houston, Texas. This was all on Good Morning America. Now, I tried to get the Hughes estate money divided between both California and Texas because of the property owned by Hughes in both states, and was instrumental. I early in the case of investigating where the taxes should go, the controller of the state, Ken Corey, came to my house with several people, and I suggested they exhume the body and decide, because he was drugged and kidnapped in California at the Beverly Hills Hotel and kept as a prisoner and then removed and had brain surgery in Boston. So the choice of residence had nothing to do with Las Vegas, because nobody in Nevada could prove that he ever lived there. And it turned out that hundreds of millions of dollars went to California and to Texas and not to Nevada. For whatever reason they decided, I could prove beyond any doubt, for whatever it is worth, that Hughes was not there and that all was a fraud. So the Attorney General at the time in Texas didn't believe that Howard Hughes was buried there. Jack Anderson said, I went directly to Texas, and Clarence Kelly assured me he processed the fingerprints himself. Well, Clarence Kelly is a liar. As a matter of fact, I have an article on the coroner. It's in my files. I have to find it for you. Of the coroner who came from Poland, who works at Houston, Texas. But I've done programs on the coroner in Washington, D.C., the team of them that have been fired or left because they were making the coroner's office political and lying about different autopsies. That was in the Washington Post, July 23rd, 1984, broadcast 661. A former D.C. medical examiner complains of political meddling in the doctor's post-mortem. Well, if you take anybody as important, as powerful as Hughes, there would also be meddling, or could be. Now, just quickly, there were reasons why he had to be turned in as of April, and they were very urgent, and I'll run them through real fast and just give them to you and to conclude, and then I'll continue with Hughes next week. Number one, Donald Nixon was testifying at the Watergate hearings, and John Meyer, M-E-I-E-R, that John Meyer, that after 1972 in June, the Watergate exposures would reveal that 20 Hughes employees that were working with Hughes were working with John Meyer and Donald Nixon, the president's brother. The second point was the Senate Watergate hearings from 1973 to 74, where Hughes attorney Chester Davis was working with Leon Jaworski. You know his history and Pac's work of covering up the Kennedy assassination and so forth. Warren Commission. They wanted to cool the grand jury inquiry into Robert Bennett's office, which was the Hughes public relations man at Mullen Associates in Washington, D.C., the Bennett office, where Watergate defendants met and made plans, and Mullen was a cover for the CIA. Mullen also represented the Free Cuba Committee and sent money to Riley Coffee Company to pay for Lee Harvey Oswald. The next point is that Robert Wright Patman, if Congress was investigating the Hughes Medical Center, the Institute was supposed to give a percentage of their profits. In order to be a tax deduction, their profits were $76.9 million in 1976, and Hughes spent $5 million on research. Another point, Congressman Rosenthal of New York suggested on the floor of Congress that Howard Hughes be declared legally dead because nobody had seen him. The next point is that the Internal Revenue wanted to see him personally about tax deductions from the Institute and look into the power of attorney and the past records up to 1972, who would take over the Institute after Howard. Jack Anderson sent out a trial balloon, writing an article at that time that Howard Hughes could be dead and that he had doubles, and that people were forging his name. The Air West lawsuit was taking place, and the stockholders demanded to see Howard Hughes and have an investigation of buying it, dropping the price low so that it could be bought cheap and then raising it up afterwards, and they lost money. And also in March, the House Rules Committee in 1976, they were getting ready to investigate the assassination of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and Congressman Madden, M-A-D-D-E-N, said, I think we should include the investigation of Howard Hughes. I read where he disappeared and it's mysterious. So that Congress that was going to have the mandate to investigate the murder of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King got the request from Mr. Madden on the Rules Committee that they should also go into Howard Hughes. And by 1974, this is 2 years later, they're doing this work. Well, the House Assassination Committee was in 1975. But in 74, I was lecturing around the country that Hughes was dead, that he had been dead. In 71, I did television shows with Mort Saul and other people when the Playgirl article came out, and was on KGO and ABC Radio and in New York lecturing that Howard Hughes was dead. And this was in conjunction with the Playgirl article. Well, the tape is up now. I had to rush that through. I'm going to get back to the Hughes with you later. It's terribly important, but we don't have any more time now, so I've got to call it quits. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.